My home was destroyed by a tornado, leaving me with nothing but a single suitcase. My son offered a place, but the moment I stepped into his pristine house, I felt like a burden, an unwanted stranger in my own child's life. They tried to break me, but I just smiled. You won't believe what happened next. Like, share, and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Evelyn had always found comfort in the familiar rhythms of her life in rural Oklahoma. At 67, the house she occupied was more than just walls and a roof. It was a living archive of her past. Every scuff on the wooden floor told a story. Every fading mark on the kitchen wall measured Daniel's growth from a toddler to a young man. Here, she had raised her son, Daniel, navigating the joys and sorrows of single parenthood after Robert, her beloved husband, passed too soon. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the porch swing, the scent of the honeysuckle by the window. These were the anchors of her existence. The tranquility shattered abruptly one late afternoon. A piercing, mechanical wail tore through the air, the unmistakable sound of a tornado siren. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She had lived through enough Oklahoma storms to recognize the urgency in that sound, but nothing had ever felt quite so menacing. She rushed to the window and her breath hitched. The sky, usually a vast canvas of blue or gentle gray, had transformed into an apocalyptic swirl of deep green and oppressive black. It wasn't just a storm, it was the sky itself manifesting pure, unadulterated rage. Adrenaline surged through her. She knew what to do, had rehearsed it countless times in her mind, though always with a detached sense of what if. Now, what if was becoming what is was. Frantically, she moved through the house, her hands trembling as she grabbed at the precious fragments of her life. Photo albums, heavy with the weight of smiling faces and forgotten moments, slid into a worn canvas suitcase. Important documents. Her will, Robert's military papers, the deed to this very house followed. Her mind raced, a frantic ticker tape of beloved objects, but there was no time, no space. She had a single suitcase, and the wind outside was already beginning to howl like a hungry beast. 43 years of memories, she whispered to herself, tears blurring her vision, and I could only save what fit in one bag. The basement door beckoned, a dark maw promising temporary safety. She scrambled down the rickety wooden steps just as the house above began to groan. It was a sound she would never forget, the tortured cry of wood tearing, glass imploding, the very foundations of her life giving way. The roar intensified to a deafening crescendo, a freight train passing directly overhead, shaking the earth itself. She huddled in the deepest corner, covering her head, praying, bargaining with a God she hadn't spoken to with such fervor in years. Time ceased to exist, replaced by the relentless, terrifying symphony of destruction. When the silence finally descended, it was almost more unsettling than the noise. A profound, unnatural quiet, broken only by the distant wail of sirens and the drip of water. Evelyn slowly, cautiously ascended the steps. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of damp earth. She pushed open the basement door, expecting chaos, but nothing could have prepared her for the vista that greeted her. Where her living room used to be, there was sky. Not a ceiling, not a roof, but the vast, bruised expanse of twilight sky, dotted with debris. The furniture was gone, obliterated or scattered into unrecognizable fragments. Her home, her sanctuary, was an open wound, exposed to the elements. Neighbors, their faces etched with similar shock and disbelief, emerged from their own storm shelters. Mrs. Jenkins, her hair askew and her eyes wide, was the first to reach her. "Evelyn, oh my dear, are you all right?" she cried, pulling Evelyn into a tight embrace. Offers of temporary shelter, a hot meal, a dry place to sleep, poured in from various people. Kind, well-meaning gestures, but Evelyn felt adrift, a shipwrecked survivor on a barren shore. The kindness was a balm, but it couldn't mend the gaping hole in her soul. She nodded, mumbled thanks, but inside she was lost, utterly and completely lost. There was only one person she truly felt she could turn to, her lifeline in a world suddenly devoid of familiar moorings. Her son, Daniel. He was all the family I had left. With trembling fingers, she found her old flip phone, miraculously still working, and dialed his number in Tulsa. The ring felt impossibly long. When he finally answered, his voice sounded far away, almost formal, as if he were speaking to a stranger. "Mom, what is it?" Evelyn choked back a sob, trying to compose herself. "Daniel," she managed, her voice raw. "The house, it's gone, a tornado, everything." A moment of silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then Daniel's voice, a little less distant, but still lacking the warmth she yearned for. "Of course, Mom. Of course. Come over, we'll figure this out." It was an invitation, yes, but it felt more like an obligation, a duty. She clung to it nonetheless. The following days were a blur of cold efficiency and crushing reality. An insurance adjuster, a man with a clipboard and an expressionless face, surveyed the wreckage. He walked through the skeletal remains of her home, jotting notes, occasionally muttering into a recorder. His final pronouncement landed like a death knell. "Total loss, Mrs. Reed." He explained that her homeowner's policy, which she had faithfully paid for decades, was for $120,000, but given the depreciation and current market values, she would only receive $90,000. It wasn't enough to rebuild, not even close. It was barely enough to restart. With a heavy heart, Evelyn began the grim task of packing. What little she had salvaged fit into 3 large garbage bags. Muddy, water-damaged clothes, some salvageable linens, items that once held meaning, but now just felt heavy. The single suitcase held the photos and documents, a stark testament to the ephemeral nature of material possessions. And then there was Robert's toolbox. It had sat in the garage, mostly unused since his passing, but it was his, full of the scent of oil and metal, a tangible link to a man who had fixed everything. It was the only other thing she absolutely had to take. The drive to Tulsa felt like a journey to a foreign country. The familiar landscapes of Oklahoma, usually a source of comfort, now seemed alien, mirroring the emptiness within her. Every tree, every field, every small town she passed felt detached from her new reality. Her old world was gone, wiped clean, and she was heading into a new one she didn't recognize. When she finally reached Daniel's neighborhood, the contrast was almost unbearable. Pristine lawns, manicured hedges, and large, immaculate houses lined the streets. Daniel's home, a modern 2-story with a polished brick facade, stood out like a beacon of untouched prosperity. Her muddy garbage bags, her one worn suitcase, and Robert's old, battered toolbox felt monstrously out of place. She suddenly felt acutely aware of her own disheveled appearance, the lingering scent of damp earth and loss clinging to her. She was a woman who had just lost everything, carrying the physical and emotional debris of a disaster, and she was about to step into a life that seemed utterly unblemished. An intruder. That's what she felt like. An intruder. She parked the borrowed truck at the curb, took a deep breath, and gripped the steering wheel. Daniel was waiting, and so was his girlfriend, Chloe. Evelyn had only met Chloe a few times, always brief, polite encounters. Now, this woman would be part of her everyday reality. A knot tightened in Evelyn's stomach. She knew deep in her weary bones that arriving with nothing but the clothes on her back and the wreckage of her past life wasn't going to make things easy. She had a feeling that the challenges ahead were not just about finding a new home, but about finding her place, if any, in Daniel's meticulously ordered life. Evelyn stepped out of Mrs. Jenkins' borrowed car, the humid Oklahoma air doing little to soothe the tremor in her hands. The house, Daniel's house, loomed before her, a stark monument to a life she no longer recognized. With a deep, shaky breath, she approached the polished front door and pressed the doorbell. The chime, a pleasant, melodic tune, seemed to mock the discord in her heart. The door opened almost immediately. Daniel stood there, a tall, well-groomed man of 38, his hair neatly styled, his expensive casual clothes immaculate. His face, familiar yet subtly altered by the years and the trappings of his prosperous life, initially offered a glimmer of hope. But as their eyes met, Evelyn felt a familiar tightening in her chest. His smile was strained, his eyes held a careful distance, maybe even discomfort. "Mom," he said, his voice level, devoid of the relief or warmth she had desperately hoped for. It was the sound of a host greeting an unexpected guest, not a son welcoming his distraught mother. Before Evelyn could even respond, Chloe materialized behind him. A sleek, elegant figure dressed impeccably in a silk blouse and tailored trousers. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She extended a hand, her smile fixed and polite, but her eyes, Evelyn noticed, did not quite reach it. There was a coolness there, a detached assessment. Evelyn, Chloe said, her voice smooth and modulated, how awful about your house. We were so sorry to hear. The words were correct, correct, perfectly phrased, yet they felt hollow, like a prepared statement. Evelyn, acutely aware of the dust on her own clothes, the faint earthy smell clinging to her from the wreckage, and the overall dishevelment of her appearance, felt a flush creep up her neck. She managed a weak smile. Thank you, Chloe. It was quite something. She clutched the handle of her worn suitcase a little tighter. I know this is an imposition, but it's just temporary, just until I sort things out. She wanted to reassure them, to minimize her presence, to signal that she wouldn't be a burden for long. Daniel shifted his weight, his gaze flitting to Chloe. A silent, swift exchange passed between them, a glance that spoke volumes, or a private language that explicitly excluded Evelyn. It was a subtle signal, a confirmation of a shared understanding that she was not privy to, and it sent a chill down her spine. Daniel finally stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The living room was a testament to meticulous taste and expensive design. Pale cream sofas, minimalist art, gleaming surfaces. It felt more like a showroom than a home. Evelyn placed her single suitcase in the 3 garbage bags by the door, feeling an almost physical aversion to letting them touch the pristine carpet. Daniel gestured vaguely towards one of the sofas, but didn't sit beside her. Instead, he perched on the armrest of an armchair opposite, maintaining a careful distance. So, Mom, he began, his voice taking on a businesslike tone, what's the plan? The question, so direct and devoid of empathy, caught Evelyn off guard. She had just lost everything. Her plan was to breathe, to figure out where her next meal was coming from, to process the fact that 43 years of her life had been reduced to rubble. But she rallied, trying to sound composed. Well, I thought I could stay here for a few weeks until the insurance money comes through. The adjuster said it would be about 3 to 4 weeks. Then I can figure out something more permanent. As she spoke, Chloe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her perfectly manicured hand found Daniel's arm, her fingers resting there in a possessive, almost territorial gesture. Daniel, catching Chloe's subtle cues, cleared his throat. He looked at Evelyn, and the words he spoke, delivered in a tone that promised heartbreak, landed squarely on her chest. Mom, you know, Chloe and I, we really value our privacy here. It's important to us. We both work from home a lot, and we have a routine. Evelyn's initial thought was to protest, to offer solutions. I wouldn't be any trouble, Daniel. I can help with chores, cook, whatever you need. I'm not helpless. Chloe offered a dismissive shake of her head. Oh no, Evelyn, it's not about that. We have a cleaning service, and we mostly eat out or order in. It's about space, you know? Her voice was saccharine, but her eyes were cold. Evelyn felt a desperate plea forming in her throat. But I'm his mother, she said, her voice barely a whisper, a desperate reminder of their bond, of the years she had poured into him. Chloe, however, seemed impervious. And we understand that, of course, she said, her tone dripping with false understanding. But perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, a place where you have your own space, your own routine. Daniel nodded in agreement, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. Yes, Mom, Chloe's right. You'd be happier with your own space. It would be less disruptive for everyone, really. His words, delivered so casually, hit Evelyn like a physical blow. The son she had nurtured, sacrificed for, was politely, almost clinically, kicking her out. The sting in her eyes was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to swallow it down. A place of my own? Daniel, the insurance money is weeks away. How exactly am I supposed to pay for an extended stay place? Right now. Her voice was laced with a bitterness she rarely allowed herself to show. Daniel hesitated, glancing at Chloe, who remained impassive. Well, he said, finally, I can give you a few hundred to tide you over until your money comes in. A few hundred for a lifetime of sacrifice. Evelyn's mind flashed back through the years, changing his diapers, endless nights by his crib when he was sick, saving every spare penny to buy him that first bicycle. cheering him on at every baseball game, working extra shifts to put him through college. Marcus, she thought, confusing him momentarily with her late husband. I changed your diapers. I taught you to ride a bike. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories, each one a stark contrast to the paltry sum he was now offering. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. Chloe, ever the diplomat, interjected. It's about boundaries, Evelyn. Every relationship needs them, and it's really healthier for everyone involved. Boundaries, the word felt foreign, alien in the context of a mother and son. Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury, quickly followed by a crushing wave of despair. Now you're kicking me out, she stated, not a question, but a raw, painful accusation. Daniel immediately bristled, defensive. No, Mom, of course not. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that this arrangement wouldn't work for anyone. Not for us, and certainly not for you. He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting to Chloe, then to the pristine coffee table, anywhere but Evelyn's heartbroken face. It was clear then. Chloe's influence was absolute. Daniel, her son, was a puppet on strings held by this woman, or perhaps a willing participant in a decision that served his own carefully constructed, comfortable life. The realization settled over Evelyn like a shroud, cold and heavy. She slowly stood up, the pain in her heart radiating through her entire body. She walked over to her bags, the muddy evidence of her catastrophe. As she bent to pick them up, Daniel, perhaps sensing a flicker of residual guilt, spoke again. I'll call you later, Mom. We can talk about it more. Evelyn paused, straightened, and looked at him, truly looked at him, for the last time as the son she thought she knew. Her voice, though quiet, was filled with a resolve that surprised even herself. Don't bother, she said. She turned, walked out of the house, and got back into Mrs. Jenkins' borrowed car. As she started the engine, she glanced back. Daniel and Chloe stood framed in the doorway, their heads together, talking, two figures in a perfectly composed tableau. They looked like actors in a drama, a scene playing out in their carefully curated world. And Evelyn, the shattered, unwanted guest, was no longer part of their script. The sting of their perceived drama, of her own deep humiliation, burned like acid. The sting of Daniel's rejection was a physical ache in Evelyn's chest as she drove Mrs. Jenkins' borrowed car away from her son's immaculate house. She had a few $100s in her purse, a handful of muddy belongings in the back, and no destination. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the Oklahoma sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful backdrop to her personal desolation. Where does a 67-year-old woman with $93 to her name and 3 garbage bags of belongings sleep tonight? The question echoed in the hollow space where her hope used to be. Her mind, still reeling from the day's events, instinctively sought a safe, inconspicuous place. A Walmart parking lot. It was well lit, usually had other overnight travelers, and offered a semblance of anonymity. As she navigated the sprawling asphalt maze, her fingers, restless and searching, brushed against something stiff in the bottom of her worn handbag, an old business card. For almost 50 years it had resided there, a forgotten relic of a life that might have been. Arthur Sterling, Arthur. The name itself was a whisper from a distant past, a ghost of first love. He had promised to come back for her, a vow made under the shade of an old oak tree, the summer before he left for college. I'm going to come back for you, Wanda, he'd promised, using her childhood nickname, a name only he had ever truly used. I'm going to make something of myself, and then I'm going to come back and marry you. His words had been fervent, his youthful eyes alight with conviction. She had believed him then, with the unquestioning faith of an 18-year-old girl. For the next 3 nights, Evelyn lived out of the borrowed car. She drove from one Walmart parking lot to another, sometimes a quiet rest stop, trying to evade notice, trying to disappear. Each morning she woke stiff and cold, the bitter taste of shame and despair coating her tongue. She bought coffee and a cheap pastry, stretching her meager funds as far as they would go. The humiliation of her situation gnawed at her, a relentless torment. This wasn't how her life was supposed to end. In those long, lonely hours, the faded business card became her constant companion. She would trace the embossed lettering with her thumb, a tangible link to a different Evelyn, a different future. On the back, in Arthur's confident, youthful hand, were the words, "Always remember W," a secret message, a private vow. It transported her back to a time when dreams were boundless, when her heart was full of Arthur Sterling, a boy of 18 with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of summer storms. He had been ambitious even then, talking endlessly about construction, about real estate, about building things. He had seen a future beyond their small Oklahoma town, and he had wanted her to be a part of it. Life, as it often does, intervened. His letters from college, initially frequent and passionate, became less so. The distance grew, not just in miles, but in the experiences that shaped them separately. Then Robert came into her life, steady, kind, reliable. Robert offered a home, a family, security, a life. Evelyn, pragmatic and yearning for stability, chose the certainty of Robert over the fading dream of Arthur. She married Robert, built a family, and buried the business card deep in her purse, a secret talisman, a quiet reminder of what might have been. Over the years, she had occasionally heard whispers through the small-town grapevine. Arthur Sterling had made good on his youthful promises. He had moved to Tulsa, started small, and built an empire. Morrison Development, people would say, was his, a name synonymous with success, with prosperity. A stark contrast to her own quiet, unremarkable life until now. The rational part of Evelyn's brain screamed at her. Calling him now was ridiculous, pathetic even. 50 years, so much had changed. She was an old woman, homeless, broken. What could he possibly do? What would he even remember? The thought alone filled her with a fresh wave of mortification. But on the fourth morning, with her cash almost depleted, her spirit at its lowest ebb, and nowhere else to turn, the absurdity of the situation gave way to a desperate, illogical hope. What did she have to lose? She stared at the card, its edges softened by time. The ink faded, but still legible. She took a shaky breath and dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a smooth, professional voice answered. Morrison Development. This is Arthur. Evelyn's heart leaped. The voice was deeper, seasoned by age and authority, but it was unmistakably him. Arthur, her throat tightened, and she found herself stumbling over her own name. Arthur, it's Evelyn. Evelyn Reed, Wanda. The old nickname slipped out, an act of sheer desperation. There was a pause on the other end, a beat of stunned silence, then, Wanda? My God, is that really you? His voice was laced with a disbelief that slowly morphed into something else. Evelyn, the dam of her composure finally breaking, poured out her story, the words tumbling out in a rush. Yes, it's me. I'm so sorry to bother you, but my house, it was destroyed by a tornado. I have nowhere to go. Daniel, my son, he doesn't want me to stay with him. The last words were a whisper of raw humiliation. Arthur's voice, when he spoke again, was sharp with concern, all professionalism gone. Wanda, where are you? Give me your location. I'm coming to get you. It wasn't a question, but a command, firm and unwavering. Evelyn, still caught between shame and shock, protested weakly. No, Arthur, you don't have to. I just thought maybe you could offer some advice. Don't be ridiculous, he interrupted, his voice softening slightly. But his tone brooked no argument. I'm already walking to my car. Tell me where you are. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, hot and unexpected. She whispered the name of the Walmart parking lot, the rows and numbers that marked her temporary exile. Arthur, she added, her voice thick with emotion. I'm not the girl you remember. The words were an honest confession, a plea for understanding. His reply, immediate and heartfelt, stole her breath. Neither am I, Wanda, but I've been waiting 50 years for this call. She sat there in the borrowed car, watching the stream of shoppers and cars, the plastic bags rustling in the wind, alternating between a dizzying panic and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Could it be true? Could this ghost of first love truly be her salvation? The next few minutes stretched into an eternity. The minutes crawled by, each second an eternity, punctuated by the thump of her own frantic heartbeat. Evelyn watched the entrance to the McDonald's parking lot, her eyes scanning every vehicle that turned in. Her initial rush of desperate hope began to curdle into doubt. What if he didn't come? What if it was a cruel joke? A momentary lapse in judgment on his part? The shame of her situation, her disheveled appearance, and the raw vulnerability of her confession overwhelmed her. Then, at precisely 11:37 a.m., a sleek silver Lexus glided into the lot. It was an executive sedan, polished to a mirror sheen, utterly out of place among the family minivans and worn pickups. Evelyn's breath hitched. A man emerged from the driver's side. Even after 50 years, even with the silver threading through his once dark hair and the deeper lines etched around his eyes and mouth, Evelyn knew him immediately. It was Arthur. The way he carried himself, that subtle tilt of his head, the familiar set of his shoulders, it was all there, preserved in her memory as if no time had passed. He began to walk towards her borrowed car, his stride long and purposeful, imbued with the same quiet confidence she remembered from their youth. His eyes, the color of summer storms, met hers across the expanse of the asphalt. They held the same intensity, the same in depth she had lost herself in all those years ago. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of mortification wash over her. Here he was, successful and elegant, and here she was, haggard and homeless, a testament to a life that had gone so spectacularly wrong. There was no hiding now. He reached her window, bending slightly, and tapped gently on the glass. A smile, warm and genuine, spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his storm-gray eyes. Evelyn's heart gave a lurch, skipping a beat she hadn't realized it was capable of. He hadn't forgotten her. His smile deepened as she slowly lowered the window. "Hello, Evelyn," he said, his voice softer than it had been on the phone, a comforting balm after days of harsh reality. He didn't avert his gaze from her face, didn't flinch at the visible signs of her ordeal. He simply studied her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else, something tender and familiar. Evelyn braced herself for pity, for an apology for her appearance, for anything that would confirm her own low estimation of herself. Instead, he offered three words that were so utterly unexpected, so profoundly transformative, that they shattered her carefully constructed wall of composure. "You look beautiful." It was as if those words were a key, unlocking a dam that had held back 50 years of tears, a lifetime of quietly being told she wasn't enough, a lifetime of bearing her own needs for the sake of others. The tears came then, hot and fast, a torrent of grief, relief, and a strange, unfamiliar joy. She didn't try to stop them. She simply wept, openly and unashamedly, right there in the Walmart parking lot. Arthur didn't hesitate. He opened her car door, his movements fluid and unhurried. He gently helped her out and without a word pulled her into a warm, strong embrace. His arms wrapped around her, holding her as she sobbed into his shoulder. The familiar scent of him, faint but undeniably him, a potent trigger for buried memories. "You should have called years ago, Wanda," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. After a long moment, Evelyn pulled back, embarrassed by the raw display of emotion. She quickly tried to wipe her tear-streaked face with the back of her hand. "I'm so sorry, Arthur," she stammered, feeling the redness spread across her cheeks. I look awful." He held her shoulders, his gaze steady and kind. He reached out and gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You look like someone who's been through hell and survived it, Wanda," he said, his voice soft but firm. "That's not disaster. That's strength. That's a beautiful kind of strength." Evelyn, still raw with humiliation, shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "It's pathetic, Arthur. My son, Daniel, he practically threw me out." Arthur's jaw tightened at the mention of Daniel, a flash of something akin to anger in his eyes. "Your son is an idiot," he stated, his voice devoid of doubt. He paused, then softened his tone again. "But I know you, Evelyn Sullivan, the girl who used to stand up for the bullied kids in school, who'd never turn away someone in need. That's who you are, Wanda, and that's who I remember." His unwavering belief, his ability to see beyond the grime and despair to the core of who she was another profound balm to her wounded spirit. He then moved to the back of her borrowed car, opening the trunk. With a quiet efficiency, he began to load her pathetic belongings, the 3 garbage bags, her single suitcase, and Robert's old toolbox, into the spacious trunk of his luxury car. As he closed the trunk, Evelyn looked at him, feeling a hesitant spark of hope ignite within her. "Where are we going, Arthur?" she asked, her voice still a little shaky. He turned, his storm gray eyes meeting hers, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Home, Wanda," he said simply. "We're going home." The drive was silent for a while, the comfortable hum of the Lexus a stark contrast to the rattling of Mrs. Jenkins' old sedan. They left the bustling commercial areas behind, heading into a part of Tulsa Evelyn rarely, if ever, ventured into. The streets became wider, lined with ancient trees and impeccably maintained landscaping. Soon they turned onto a private road, and before her, hidden behind imposing stone walls and elaborate iron gates, stood an estate. Arthur pulled up to the gates, which silently swung open, revealing a long, winding driveway flanked by mature trees. At the end of it, nestled into the landscape, was a magnificent house. It was built of stone and timber, sprawling and elegant, yet understated. It wasn't ostentatious. It was a testament to timeless design and solid craftsmanship. Evelyn gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "This is incredible, Arthur." He glanced at her, a hint of melancholy in his storm gray eyes. "It's too big, Wanda," he said, his voice quiet. "Built for a dream that didn't quite materialize." He paused, looking out at the sweeping lawn. "Some dreams don't work out the way you plan." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Evelyn, her heart still thrumming with the unexpected turn of events, gathered her courage. "Did you ever marry Arthur?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "Came close a few times," he admitted, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "But there was always something missing." "What about you, Wanda, after Robert?" The unspoken question, the 50-year-old regret, was palpable. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss a single part of Evelyn's incredible journey. Let's see how her world transforms. The front door of Arthur's estate opened onto a vast foyer where sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating polished hardwood floors and a grand staircase. Inside, the house was even more impressive than its exterior suggested, yet it possessed a warmth that belied its size. Rich wood paneling, comfortable-looking leather armchairs, and shelves overflowing with books created an atmosphere of lived-in elegance. This wasn't a cold museum. It was clearly a home, filled with personal touches, artifacts from a well-traveled life and the quiet comfort of a solitary man's sanctuary. Arthur led her through a wide archway into a kitchen that was larger than Evelyn's entire old living room. Gleaming stainless steel appliances, a massive island, and panoramic windows offering views of lush greenery stretched before her. The aroma of something fresh and green lingered in the air. "Are you hungry, Wanda?" he asked, not waiting for an answer as he already moved with practiced ease towards the refrigerator, pulling out containers of pre-chopped vegetables and marinated chicken. His movements were efficient, confident, mirroring the man she remembered, but with an added grace that only comes with age and experience. Evelyn, suddenly aware of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, realized she hadn't truly eaten since the morning of the tornado. Starving was an understatement. Yet the old instincts of minimizing her imposition kicked in. "Oh, Arthur, you don't have to," she began, trying to sound polite and self-sufficient. "I don't want to be any trouble." He stopped, turning to face her, a soft smile on his lips. "Trouble with Sonio," he repeated, his storm gray eyes twinkling. "Wanda, you're the answer to a question I've been asking for 50 years. You're no trouble. Sit." He gestured to a high stool at the island, and Evelyn, feeling a strange mix of deference and comfort, obeyed. As he worked, efficiently grilling chicken and tossing roasted vegetables, Evelyn's gaze drifted around the kitchen. On a nearby shelf, intermingled with cookbooks and ceramic dishes, she saw framed photographs, snapshots of Arthur throughout his successful life. At groundbreaking ceremonies, shaking hands with dignitaries, standing in front of impressive buildings bearing the Morrison Development logo. In every picture, he wore the same confident, engaging smile. Yet in many of them, he was accompanied by elegant women, their faces beautiful. their poses often affectionate. But Evelyn noticed something subtle, something she might have missed had she not known him so intimately, so long ago. Their smiles, though genuine, never quite reached his eyes in the same way. He always looked successful, content, but never quite complete. A flicker of hope, bold and undeniable, ignited within her. Soon, a plate of perfectly grilled chicken and fragrant roasted vegetables was placed before her. The meal was simple, elegant, and utterly delicious. As Evelyn ate, slowly savoring each bite, Arthur sat opposite her, nursing a glass of iced tea. "So," he said, his voice gentle, "tell me about your life, Wanda." "Everything." And so she did. She found herself recounting the narrative of her existence, a story she hadn't consciously pieced together in years. She spoke of her marriage to Robert, the steady, comforting presence he had been, the quiet joy of raising Daniel. She spoke of the gradual fading of her own dreams, replaced by the responsibilities and quiet satisfactions of motherhood and homemaking. She detailed the tornado, the terrifying roar, the utter devastation, and the surreal experience of watching her home evaporate. Finally, her voice growing thick with unshed tears, she spoke of Daniel's rejection, the coldness in his eyes, the casual way he had dismissed her. Arthur listened intently, his expression unwavering, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He simply absorbed every word, every nuance of her pain. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle clinking of her fork against the plate. "Wanda," he said finally, his voice soft, "I am so incredibly sorry for all you have been through, for your losses, for your pain." He reached across the island, covering her hand with his. His touch was warm, comforting, and utterly familiar. "But I'm not sorry you called me." He paused, his gaze intensifying, then continued, his voice barely a whisper, thick with emotion. "Because I never stopped loving you, Wanda. Not once. Every success, every building I put up, every dollar I made, it was all so I could be worthy of you when you came back to me. So I could offer you the life I promised, if by some miracle you ever did." Evelyn's breath hitched. 50 years. The sheer audacity of such a long-held love, such an unwavering hope. It was crazy, she knew, utterly fantastical. Yet as she looked at him, at his earnest, vulnerable expression, she felt a profound sense of rightness. A missing piece, a void she hadn't even realized existed, clicked into place within her heart. She looked down at their joined hands, her own wrinkled and age-spotted, his strong and weathered by time. "I'm not that girl anymore, Arthur," she said, her voice raspy. "I'm old, I'm broken." He squeezed her hand gently. "No, Wanda, you're better. You're real. You're the woman that potential became. The girl I loved was full of dreams and fire, and I see that same fire in you now, tempered by life, yes, but burning brighter than ever." His words resonated deep within her, echoing truths she had long forgotten about herself. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly valued, not for what she could do for others, but for who she intrinsically was. A fragile, tremulous hope blossomed in her chest. "What happens now, Arthur?" she asked, the question carrying the weight of a lifetime. He smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that finally reached those storm-gray eyes, erasing all traces of his earlier melancholy. "Now," he said, his voice rich with possibility, "we figure out what the rest of our lives look like. Together, if you'll have me." In that moment, Evelyn realized something profound. The tornado, Daniel's rejection, the despair that had almost consumed her, they weren't just calamities. They were the crucible, the necessary destruction that had cleared the way for something entirely new. The obliteration of her old life hadn't been an ending. It had been the violent, painful, yet ultimately liberating act that made room for the life she was always meant to have. The first few days of living in Arthur's magnificent home were a strange blend of overwhelming gratitude and acute awkwardness for Evelyn. It felt less like a rekindled romance and more like two polite strangers sharing a vast, luxurious space. Her old life, with its familiar clutter and comforting routines, was gone. Here, every surface gleamed, every object was meticulously placed, and she was acutely aware of her own presence, like a misplaced artifact in a pristine gallery. Arthur, however, seemed determined to make her comfortable. He immediately assigned her to the entire guest wing, a lavish suite of rooms with its own sitting area, a sumptuous bathroom, and a bedroom that felt larger than her entire old house. It was a level of luxury Evelyn had only ever seen in magazines, and the sheer generosity of it made her both grateful and slightly unsettled. She felt the weight of his kindness, acutely aware of the chasm between their respective stations in life. Yet Arthur was endlessly patient. He moved around her with a gentle consideration, always asking if she needed anything, never pushing, simply existing in a way that slowly allowed Evelyn to relax. Gradually, the initial stiffness began to thaw. The scent of fresh coffee in the mornings, the rustle of newspapers, the quiet conversations about the weather or the day's plans, these small, daily rituals began to weave a new tapestry of normalcy. Evelyn, accustomed to a lifetime of nurturing, found her hands restless in the absence of chores. One morning, she found herself drifting into the enormous kitchen, where Arthur had left a note for the housekeeper with instructions for breakfast. Almost without thinking, she started making coffee herself, the familiar ritual of comfort. Soon she was preparing simple lunches, then, emboldened by Arthur's genuine appreciation, tentative dinners. She rediscovered the joy of cooking, a joy she hadn't realized she had missed. Arthur's response to her cooking was heartwarming. He ate with an almost boyish enthusiasm, praising every dish, every flavor. "Wanda," he'd say, his eyes lighting up, "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this in years. It's perfect." The word perfect echoed in her ears. Evelyn knew she was far from perfect. Her hands were gnarled with age, her face etched with wrinkles, her heart scarred by loss. Yet when Arthur said it, when he looked at her with such unvarnished adoration, she saw herself reflected through his eyes. Beautiful, someone worthy of love, worthy of his unwavering affection. They fell into a natural rhythm. Mornings often began with coffee on the expansive back porch, watching the sun rise over Arthur's meticulously landscaped gardens. Afternoons sometimes involved leisurely walks through those same gardens, or trips to town for errands. Evenings, however, were their true time together. These were the hours dedicated to catching up on 50 years of separate lives, a delicate dance of sharing memories, regrets, and unspoken questions. Evelyn spoke of Robert, of the quiet, dependable love they had shared, and the deep, aching loneliness that followed his death. She recounted the struggles of being a single mother, the sacrifices made for Daniel, the pride in his accomplishments, and the subsequent, crushing disappointment of his rejection. Arthur listened, his gaze unwavering, often reaching for her hand across the polished surface of the antique dining table, his touch a silent balm to her exposed wounds. Arthur, in turn, shared the story of his own life. He spoke of the relentless drive to build his business empire, the countless hours, the triumphs, and the occasional setbacks. He detailed the women he had dated, the relationships that had almost blossomed into something permanent. He spoke of their beauty, their intelligence, their shared interests, but always he ended with the same quiet refrain. None of them had ever made him feel truly complete. Then he told her about Eleanor. Eleanor was brilliant, Wanda, he recalled, his voice tinged with a distant respect. A lawyer, sharp as a tack, incredibly successful in her own right. We dated for years. Everyone said we were perfect for each other. As he spoke, a familiar, unwelcome stab of jealousy pierced Evelyn's heart. 50 years might have passed, but the vestiges of that youthful possessiveness, that primal fear of losing him, still lingered. Arthur noticed the subtle shift in her expression. He reached for her hand, his thumb gently tracing patterns on her skin. "We were engaged," he continued, his voice softer, more reflective. "The wedding was planned, invitations sent. Everything was set for the biggest society wedding of the year." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I called it off, Wanda. The night before, I couldn't do it." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You called off your wedding?" He nodded, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers, full of a raw honesty that took her breath away. "I realized, Wanda, that I was still in love with a girl I'd known 50 years ago, a girl who kept appearing in my dreams. who was the benchmark for every woman I ever met, and no one measured up because they weren't you. The revelation hit Evelyn deeply, a wave of profound emotion washing over her. He had called off a wedding, sacrificed what everyone considered the perfect life, because of her, because of a ghost, a memory, a love that had never truly faded. It was a love that defied logic, defied time, defied all reason. A small, disbelieving laugh escaped her lips. That's, that's insane, Arthur, she whispered, shaking her head. 50 years, that's just crazy. He smiled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Is it any crazier, Wanda? He countered, his grip on her hand tightening, than you keeping my business card in your purse for 50 years? A card you called only when you had absolutely nowhere else to go. He was right. They were both crazy. Two souls separated by half a century of life, tragedy, and triumphs, yet bound by an invisible thread of love that had simply refused to break. 3 weeks into her stay with Arthur, Evelyn found herself humming a cheerful tune as she prepared dinner in his expansive kitchen. The aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air, mingling with the subtle scent of fresh flowers from a vase on the island. The awkwardness had long since faded, replaced by a comfortable rhythm, a gentle rediscovery of a love that had defied time. She felt lighter, more vibrant than she had in decades. Her phone, which she usually kept on silent, suddenly vibrated loudly on the countertop. It was Daniel. Her hum died in her throat. She hesitated, then picked it up, a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity stirring within her. Mom, is that you? Your phone's been going straight to voicemail. Daniel's voice was carefully controlled, a little too smooth, a little too precise. It immediately put Evelyn on guard. Where have you been and where are you living? Evelyn's initial instinct was to protect her newfound happiness, to shield Arthur from Daniel's judgmental gaze. Oh, I'm fine, Daniel, she replied, keeping her tone light, vague. Just staying with a friend. My phone must have died. There was a pause, a beat of disbelieving silence from Daniel's end. A friend? Mom, you never mentioned having friends with a place like this. Who are you staying with? His words, though subtly phrased, carried a familiar sting. He knew her past isolation, her simple life, and the implication was clear. She didn't have friends who lived in homes grand enough to justify her sudden disappearance. The sting was still there, a ghost of her past wounds, even though she now knew how wrong he was. That's not important right now, Daniel, Evelyn said, her voice firm, a new strength she hadn't known she possessed shining through. Mom, we need to talk, Daniel insisted, a hint of desperation creeping into his tone. Chloe and we've been talking. We might have been a bit too hasty when you first came. We were under a lot of stress. Evelyn held the phone away from her ear for a moment, a wry smile touching her lips. Too hasty, Daniel, she mused, remembering the cold, clinical way he and Chloe had dismissed her. Yes, Mom, he continued, seemingly emboldened by her lack of immediate rejection. We'd like you to come back, to stay in our guest room, just until you get back on your feet. We care about you, Mom. His words were hollow, ringing with insincerity. Evelyn knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this sudden change of heart wasn't about genuine concern. It was about something else entirely. Perhaps a neighbor had seen her, impeccably dressed and smiling, stepping into Arthur's luxury car. Or perhaps word had somehow spread about her new, comfortable circumstances. Daniel's offer felt less like an olive branch and more like a calculated move, a desperate attempt to reclaim a narrative or a perceived financial benefit. The insult, even wrapped in feigned concern, was unmistakable. What changed your mind, Daniel? Evelyn asked, her voice cool, devoid of emotion. Was it a sudden burst of filial affection? He stumbled, clearly unprepared for her directness. No, Mom, it's not like that. We realized we were too focused on our own needs, on our privacy. We love you. The lie was palpable, an almost physical presence in the air. Thank you for the offer, Daniel, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with an icy politeness she hadn't realized she was capable of. But I'm perfectly happy where I am. Happy? Daniel scoffed, disbelief coloring his voice. Mom, you're staying with a stranger. Do you even know anything about this man? What if he's taking advantage of you? At your age, you are vulnerable. The audacity of his concern, coming from the son who had just weeks ago turned her away, ignited a spark of defiance in Evelyn. I know enough, Daniel, she retorted, her voice rising slightly. I know that he's never made me feel like a burden. I know that he welcomes me into his home, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as someone he cares for. And I know that he tells me I'm beautiful every single day. There was a sharp intake of breath from Daniel's end. His voice tightened, edged with a mixture of surprise and something else, something possessive. Is this a relationship, Mom? You're actually dating someone? That, Daniel, Evelyn stated, her voice now steady and resolute, is none of your business. It is my business, he insisted, his composure finally cracking. I'm your son. I'm concerned about you. Concerned? Evelyn's laughter was sharp, devoid of humor. Like you took advantage of me, Daniel? Like you were concerned when I called you, homeless and heartbroken? You turned me away when I needed help most. You chose your privacy over your own mother. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She could hear Chloe's voice in the background now, a muffled, agitated whisper, clearly prompting Daniel. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his authoritative tone. Mom, this is ridiculous. We should all talk. Maybe you can bring him to dinner. We can meet him properly. Evelyn felt a powerful surge of adrenaline, a delicious sense of liberation. This was it. This was her moment. No, Daniel, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. You don't get to approve or disapprove of my choices anymore. You gave up that right when you kicked me out. And then, with a decisive click, Evelyn hung up the phone. She stood there, her chest heaving slightly, the phone still in her hand, feeling a tremor run through her. It was a tremor not of fear, but of profound satisfaction. She had finally spoken her truth, asserted her worth, and cut the cord of a toxic expectation. The relief was immense, intoxicating. Arthur walked into the kitchen, drawn by the sudden silence, a gentle query in his eyes. He saw the flush on her cheeks, the slight trembling of her hands, but also the fierce light in her eyes. Everything all right, Wanda? He asked, his voice soft with concern. Evelyn took a deep breath, a triumphant smile slowly spreading across her face. That was Daniel, she said, her voice still a little shaky but filled with a newfound strength. He wants to meet you. He wants me to come back. Arthur's smile was slow, confident, and entirely reassuring. He walked over, took her hand, and squeezed it gently. I've been looking forward to meeting him, Wanda, he said, his storm gray eyes sparkling. And don't you worry, nobody, especially not your son, is going to make you doubt that you belong here. Not anymore. 6 months after that pivotal phone call, Evelyn stood in Arthur's breathtaking back garden, the scent of roses and jasmine filling the warm spring air. She wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, a delicate lace veil adorning her silver hair. Beside her, Arthur, handsome and distinguished in a tailored suit, held her hand, his storm gray eyes alight with love. This time there was no fuss, no fanfare, no stress about impressing anyone. This was her wedding to Arthur, a ceremony as intimate and genuine as the love they shared. Their guests were a small group of Arthur's closest friends and Mrs. Jenkins, Evelyn's loyal neighbor. Daniel was there too, alone. Evelyn had explicitly uninvited Chloe after a particularly sharp exchange during a pre-wedding conversation. Daniel, Evelyn had stated, her voice calm but resolute, I appreciate you wanting to bring Chloe, but I need this day to be free of any tension. If you can't accept her as my partner, I can accept her as yours, but I won't be manipulated or undermined by her on my wedding day. Daniel had grumbled, but ultimately conceded, a clear indication of his priorities. He looked uncomfortable throughout the ceremony, shifting his weight, offering strained smiles when necessary. When it came time for congratulations, he shook Arthur's hand, his grip a little too firm, and managed a stiff hug for Evelyn. Evelyn, however, noticed the calculation in his eyes as he subtly took inventory of Arthur's opulent surroundings, the expensive suits of the other guests, the sheer scope of Arthur's wealth. It wasn't about her happiness, she realized with a pang of sadness. It was about the potential opportunities he was already mentally cataloging. During the simple lunch that followed, Daniel, glass of champagne in hand, made a concerted effort to connect with Arthur. His conversation quickly turned to business, fishing for details about Arthur's and company, dropping hints about potential synergies and investment opportunities. Arthur, ever the gentleman, listened patiently, offering polite but non-committal deflections, his gaze occasionally meeting Evelyn's with a silent, knowing understanding. Over the subsequent weeks, Daniel's calls to Evelyn became remarkably regular, almost daily. The conversations, initially about Evelyn's well-being, quickly shifted, invariably circling back to Arthur's business ventures, his investments, his properties. Evelyn watched, a mix of amusement and frustration swirling within her, as Daniel tried to charm Arthur, deploying every bit of salesmanship he possessed. He even attempted a revisionist history of their own relationship, painting himself as the devoted son who had only ever wanted the best for his mother. Arthur, with his lifetime of experience navigating boardrooms and negotiating deals, saw straight through it all. Often during one of Daniel's overly effusive calls, Arthur would squeeze Evelyn's hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the charade. Then came the expensive gifts from Chloe, designer scarves, a lavish spa voucher, an ornate jewelry box. Each item felt like a veiled bribe, a desperate attempt to buy her way back into Evelyn's good graces, to mend a rift that Chloe herself had deepened. Evelyn simply placed them in a spare room, untouched, a testament to a superficiality she no longer tolerated. 3 months after the wedding, Daniel called again, his voice carefully casual. "Mom, Jim," he began, after a perfunctory inquiry about her health, "I was just wondering, with Arthur being so successful, has he made any arrangements for his assets in the future? You know, for when he's no longer around?" Evelyn felt a cold fury rising within her. The sheer audacity, the incredible inappropriateness of the question, especially coming from the son who had rejected her when she was at her lowest. It was a blatant display of opportunism, a calculated probe into Arthur's will. "Daniel," she exclaimed, her voice sharp with indignation. "How could you even ask such a thing? What does that have to do with anything?" He mumbled something about just thinking about your security, Mom. But Evelyn had heard enough. Her anger was mixed with a deep, aching hurt. Her son, her only child, saw her not as a person, not as his mother, but as an opportunity, a means to an end. Without another word, she hung up the phone, her hand trembling. Arthur found her moments later, sitting by the window in their shared study, tears streaming down her face. He sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her, offering the silent comfort she now cherished. "He asked about your will, didn't he?" Arthur said, his voice quiet but full of understanding. Evelyn nodded, burying her face in his shoulder. "How did you know?" "Because that's what he's been doing for months, Wanda," Arthur replied, gently stroking her hair. "Don't let it upset you. His choices reflect on him, not on you. You are loved, you are valued, and you are far more than any inheritance." 2 weeks later, Arthur, having watched Daniel's persistent attempts with growing disapproval, invited Daniel and Chloe for dinner. Evelyn felt a knot of dread in her stomach, but Arthur's calm resolve reassured her. "It's time, Wanda," he had said, "to set some boundaries." That evening, the grand dining room, usually filled with laughter and gentle conversation, was charged with a palpable tension. Arthur, seated at the head of the table, was formidable, his customary courtesy underlaid with a steel Evelyn had rarely witnessed. After the pleasantries of dinner were over and coffee was served, he finally addressed them, his voice calm but authoritative. "Daniel, Chloe," Arthur began, his gaze steady as he looked from one to the other, "I've observed your interactions with Evelyn these past months. You've been treating your mother with a level of attention and concern that's remarkably different from how you treated her when she actually needed your help, when she had nothing." Daniel started to protest, but Arthur raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me finish. Evelyn deserves unconditional love and support, not a calculated charm offensive. She doesn't need your approval of her choices, nor does she need protection from supposed fortune hunters, because she is a woman of sound mind, and I am a man who loves her deeply. Your actions, Daniel, strike me as nothing short of opportunism." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a serious tone. I will not tolerate anyone treating my wife as a means to an end. You need to decide, Daniel, whether you genuinely care for your mother for who she is, or if you're merely seeking personal gain. If it's the latter, then I suggest you reconsider the nature of your future relationship with her, and indeed, with me. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel and Chloe, stunned by Arthur's directness, exchanged panicked glances. When they left shortly after, the house felt lighter, the tension evaporating like morning mist. Evelyn, still reeling, looked at Arthur. "Was that too harsh?" she asked, a small voice. He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "No, Wanda," he said, taking her hand. "That was honest. And sometimes honesty is exactly what's needed to set boundaries." 8 months after Arthur's firm yet polite confrontation, Daniel's calls to Evelyn had undergone a remarkable transformation. They were shorter, yes, but also more genuine, less calculated. The thinly veiled attempts to extract information about Arthur's business had ceased. Instead, Daniel would ask about her garden, the flowers she was cultivating, her book club, or the volunteer work she had recently started at a local animal shelter. There was still a certain distance, an awkwardness born from past wounds, but the opportunism that had so deeply hurt Evelyn was no longer present. Chloe, for her part, had stopped sending gifts entirely. The silence from her was a welcome relief, a sign that the message had been received and understood. Evelyn accepted that a close, intimate relationship with Daniel, the kind she had once dreamed of, might never fully materialize. The chasm carved by his rejection and his subsequent calculated attempts to benefit from her new circumstances was too deep to fully bridge. But they had something honest now, a connection free of pretense and manipulation. And maybe, Evelyn mused as she approached her 69th birthday, that was enough. She woke each morning in Arthur's arms, in the sprawling, sun-drenched master bedroom that had become their sanctuary. The soft light of dawn filtered through the silk curtains, illuminating Arthur's peaceful face beside her. At 68, Evelyn felt happier than she ever remembered being, even in her youth. It wasn't the wealth, the grand house, or the luxuries that Arthur provided that brought her this profound contentment. It was the simple, invaluable gift of being seen. Arthur truly saw her, recognized the woman she was, loved her for all her wrinkles and scars, and cherished the fire that still burned within her. He chose to love what he saw unconditionally, unreservedly. The tornado had taken her old life, a life built on routine and quiet sacrifice, a life where her own needs often came last. For a long time, she had viewed it as a brutal act of destruction, an irreparable loss. But now, nestled safely in the warmth of Arthur's embrace, Evelyn understood. Destruction, she mused, was just another word for renovation. The violent winds had swept away not just her physical home, but also the limiting beliefs, the silent expectations, and the unfulfilling patterns that had defined her existence. It had cleared the ground for a new foundation, a stronger structure, a more vibrant garden. Sometimes losing everything leads to finding everything you actually needed. She had lost her house, her sense of security, and the illusion of her son's unconditional love. In return, she had found her voice, her strength, and a love that had patiently waited for half a century to finally bloom. And sometimes, just sometimes, first love gets a second chance to become forever love. Their story was a testament to that enduring truth, a testament to the power of a promise held not just in the heart, but on a faded business card. Arthur's business card, that fragile, yellowed scrap of paper she had carried for 50 years, was no longer hidden in the bottom of her purse. It now rested in a place of honor, framed and displayed prominently on his desk in the study. It was a tangible reminder, a silent witness to their improbable journey. A reminder that some promises are worth keeping, even when it takes half a century to fulfill them. Especially then. It was a promise that had weathered the storms of life, the passage of time, and the heartbreak of separation. A promise that, in the end, had brought two souls back together, proving that love, true love, is timeless, resilient, and always, always worth the wait.